I'm Terry David Mulligan. This is the Mulligan Stew Podcast. It breaks my heart to say, as an opening line, I wish I could have done this interview with Mac Rebennack, Dr. John. There's a final Dr. John album, was just released on Friday. It's called Things Happen That Way. And the title and the titles within the album all seem to point to an indication, to me anyway, that he knew there was an end in sight. I mean, if you look at the titles, Funny How Time Slips Away, Give Me That Old Time Religion with Willie Nelson, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, End of the Line with Aaron Neville, the Traveling Wilburys song, Sleeping Dogs Best Left Alone, Give Myself a Good Talking To, and Guess Things Happen That Way. I think he knew. I think Mac Rebennack knew that time was in fact slipping away on him. By the way, the track that Dr. John and Lukas Nelson and the Promise of the Real did was his great original song, I Walk on Gilded Splinters. Our guest, Ken Ehrlich, describes that song as Mac Rebennack's Rhapsody in Blue. Ken Ehrlich, for almost 40 years, was the producer and executive producer of the Grammy Awards, and as such had a serious hand on the pulse of music. And he became friends with Mac Rebennack, Dr. John. Mac had won 6 Grammys. And it was Mac who turned Ken on to the music of New Orleans and became a huge fan of the music of the city of New Orleans. And so when Mac Rebennack passed away, not too long ago, Ken Ehrlich was asked to speak to his friends and family that assembled for his memorial celebration of life. And it was an honor for him to write a speech and then give it. And we're going to hear some of that speech today. He also wrote the liner notes for this album, Things Happen That Way. So he comes at this from, normally we talk to the artist, we talk to people who worked with the artists. But in this case, Ken Ehrlich knew Mac Rebennack really well, and they were good friends. And he understood the journey that Mac took along the way, which is where we're going to start, actually. We're going to start when, and Mac talks about this in his book, he had a real serious fight and addiction with heroin. And it wasn't until he got clean that all the pieces fell into place for him. Lesson learned. So I had a chance to talk to Mac and be at the last waltz when he sang. And I'll tell a story. Do enjoy this. This is Ken Ehrlich, producer of the Grammys, the former executive producer of the Grammys, talking about his friend Mac Rebennack. The album just came out yesterday. It's called Things Happen That Way. Enjoy. I met him. I went in to do a Ronnie Hawkins interview at Ronnie Hawkins' farm. And he's in a tiled room, so it's kind of bouncy anyway. He's at the piano and he's listening to demos for songs to record. And it's Mac coming out of the speaker, a cassette. Eerie sound of his voice in that tiled room stuck with. I said, who is that? Who is that? And it's Mac Rebennack's Dr. John. I saw him later at the Last Waltz. I finally got a chance to interview him at the Town Pump in Vancouver. And somebody previously had told me, ask him about his fingers, his hands, because he's playing piano. And I said, wow, let me see your hands. And they were, I said, how'd you get those cuts? He said, knife fights. Yeah. And he had lost, part of that finger. And so we couldn't play guitar anymore. The dark times, he wrote about it in his book. How did he survive those days? How did he survive drugs?
I don't know. Obviously, we walked in and out of each other's lives intermittently. They were almost always related to TV shows we were doing, and there were gaps, and I could see changes in him. And I think there were probably a couple times, probably sometime in the 80s when he was not in good shape that I saw him. Matter of fact, I don't know that he'd mind my telling the story. I know I've told it to Carla when we did the show in '75. He asked me. These were PBS shows. We didn't have a whole lot of limos. And I used to go to O'Hare and pick up the acts, and I'd spend a half hour driving them back
Sure.
to the studio, which was great fun for me because if I knew him, we could reminisce. If I didn't know him, whatever. Anyway, he had a little piece of paper, and he gives me this piece of paper. He said, "Can you take me here for a minute before we go to the station?" And I didn't recognize the address. It was not in a bad neighborhood. It was kind of like northwest side of Chicago, and we went there. And as he gets out of the car and he goes in, I realized this is a methadone clinic, and that's where he was going. So that was kind of like we didn't talk about it very much, but he knew I was aware of the downtimes. So, which, by the way, getting to the record, I still call it a record. Sorry, he really deals with in a Mackian way.
Yes, he does.
On this project.
Yeah,
these two songs in particular, "Sleeping Dogs Best Left Alone."
Yeah.
"Holy Water," two of the new songs on that album, deal specifically, one with his recovery, and two with "Holy Water" being bad stuff that he spent his whole life dealing with. Not his whole life until he got clean.
And when he did get clean, things fell into place. Everything, it wasn't just happen chance, it all fell into place.
He was a different person. The old danger that you hear about, well, wait a minute, if he cleans up, he's still going to be as great as he was.
Yes.
Musically, he was as good or better, really, all the way through. Amazing. I just didn't know anybody like him.
The project, the album, Things Happen That Way. Did you want to be in that room? Were you available?
I obviously would have loved to. I didn't. I want to make it clear that I didn't come aboard to this until after it was done, and like anybody else, I heard in advance of it, but I didn't. It was like, hey, we got a new Mac album. You knew him, he knew you. Would you listen to it? And of course, I listened to it, and first of all, you close your eyes and you get transported, and but it was just it was Mac, and yet it was, as Mac always was, in evolution in some ways.
I think there's a quote here. I love this quote. The writer Chris Rose describes Mac's voice as a mashup of Tom Waits, Phyllis Diller, and a bullfrog in heat.
Yeah.
I went down to San Francisco and checked out Big Daddy Tom Donahue and discovered that underground radio was starting in early 68. I went down there, spent a week there, realized what I had to do, came back, ordered all the albums. And so when we finally launched the first underground station in Vancouver, there were two albums came in. Taj Mahal, the first Taj Mahal album with Ry Cooder, and the Gree album. And I went, what the hell is this? But it all came to be, and it ends up, and we still see these elements on this new music.
Absolutely. I'm an old guy. I promise you I'm older than you. So my first musical loves were probably a little before yours, but they were Huey Piano Smith, and they were Jesse Hill, and they were all these New Orleans. And I will confess, it was before. I certainly didn't picture myself spending my life in it, but I loved the music. And so getting to know him and getting to know, having somebody that you could sit with and he could talk to you about James Booker. He could talk to you about
Memphis Minnie,
Bobby Marchand.
Yeah.
And it was like, God, it was like everything I missed when all I could do was put my little 45 on a record player. I got from Mac. And both in person, but also always on record.
These are songs that speak to the last act of a life. I mean, I'm talking about Willie and he doing that duet, but then the words start to take on a completely different weight, right? A texture.
Yeah. I was just talking to Scarlett a little while ago and talking about that duet in particular. And I don't think I heard this the first few times I listened to the album, but I listened to it in anticipation of our conversation yesterday, and and I've worked with Willie a number of times as well. What it really, to me, it's one of the keystone numbers on that album for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the song. But this mix of these two voices, I had always felt that Willie Nelson had one of the sweetest honey dipped voices in the history. I mean, it was like it was butter, you know. And Mac was the other guy. Mac was the rough. Mac just walked out of the jungle, you know, out of a bear's lair, you know. And here were these two voices that were so totally different, but the mix of them, even when they were singing lines in unison, it wasn't just harmonies. When they were singing in unison, it was like it probably took me back to some of the early Mac stuff because it was different than anything I'd ever heard before.
And I never heard anybody do a different turn of "Give Me That Old Time Religion." I've always heard it sung straight out and strummed and whatever. This is different.
I don't know a lot of family secrets, you know, but what I do know about this record, which pertains to what you just said, is that Mac had total editorial control on this, creative control on this record. And he probably didn't on some of the other projects in the early days. By the way, he had great producers in those days. And I'm sure a lot, you know, you couldn't really direct Mac. You could try. But this album, when you listen to it, you know that he was in charge because he took some of the familiar songs. He just kind of retranslated them. He gave them a new life, you know. And Give Me Old Time Religion is one. Guess Things Happen That Way is one. Almost every song on the album, the classics, the standards, they were newly minted.
I'm kind of intrigued, Ken, by Walk on Gilded Splinters, which was on that Gree album of 1968. I never thought he'd go back and re-record it in any fashion, except for maybe live. But to do it with Lukas Nelson and the Promise, and keep New Orleans in it, but change its shape and still come out honoring the song is fantastic. It's beautifully done.
Yeah, that's maybe, other than a couple of the obvious classics, Such a Night and Right Place. Walk on Gilded Splinters to me, and I think I've said this to a number of people over the years, to me, that is Mac's Rhapsody in Blue. It just is. It's timeless.
Wow.
It changes figures in the song. The origin, as I'm sure you know, goes all the way back to voodoo and juju and the swamps and all of that. That the root of that is it's an old voodoo chant.
That's right. For people who've never been to New Orleans or don't know a lot about New Orleans, this isn't just something that a marketing team made up. This is life in New Orleans, in the various small villages, the small camps, the Indian tribes. When you see the marching bands in the Mardi Gras parade, they're each marching for their district in the city, and it's a wicked competition. And there's hundreds of bands, so music is literally in the blood. And so out of this steps Mac Rebennack and says, "I'm not going to be. I mean, I will go." He went through, as you well know. He went through the Phil Spector School and all that stuff and making hit records and all that stuff. But he always had New Orleans and felt he could be the voice of New Orleans to a generation or two.
Absolutely. There was nobody. There was nobody. And he connected the generations. To go back to Gilded Splinters for a second, and Lukas Nelson, who I've only worked with him 2 or 3 times. We actually did an Elvis Presley 50th anniversary of the comeback special.
Yeah.
And I used him on a couple of cuts with a couple of artists on a couple of performances. But I think Mac's known him, I think, since around 2009, 2010, when he was a kid. Still kind of a kid, to Mac. And he just saw something in him. And I think obviously it was influenced by Willie, but he had always wanted to work with him. And I don't know that he had done much before this album, but one of the things that And again, I didn't spend a whole lot of time with Mac in the studio, but I know that when I would put him with people, one of the best examples is funny. I hadn't thought about it till this second. I did a BB show. Maybe I had done it with him before, and I asked one of my favorites. The duets that he did was "I'd Rather Go Blind" with Etta James.
Nice.
And I did that probably 4 times over 20 years with him. But my point is, he did it differently with Etta every time, and you could see he was kind of like understanding of the artists that he worked with, so that it wasn't just about we're going to do my song. This is how we're going to do it, you know. And that's, I think, why Walk on Gilded Splinters is so successful, because obviously there's a lot of Lukas in that. It's still Mac's song, and it'll always be Mac's song. But you know, I'm convinced that Mac listened to Lukas and then said, "Okay, you know, what about this? What about that? You know?" And I think it's. I'm not here to pump a record, but I have to tell you, that to me is every cut is wonderful, but that one is just because, like you, I'm sure we're so familiar with that song, to hear it reinvented again in this form was magical.
You just made me realize that the person who told me to check out Dr. John's Hands was Etta James, who had played that same club about 3 weeks earlier. I had to wait until 3 a.m. to get the interview. That's why I remember.
They were incredible together. There was a magic, and you can Google it. It's there are several of the versions. I did it on the Midnight Special one year.
Yeah,
I did it on this BB show, and I think and I did it in Chicago on one of the soundstage shows. But every one of them is a little different, and you know, I mean,
Ken Ehrlich has joined me as this wonderful guest, and by way of the fact that he wrote the liner notes for the new Dr. John album, Things Happen That Way, and spoke at his memorial funeral, and a great friend to Mac Rebennack, who better to just talk about this music and Mac's life, because there's still generations who have no idea who he is. There are people who will discover him far too late in their life. They could have had him all along, but he's there. Seeing him at The Last Waltz, by the way, was fantastic. Oh. And such a night. Yes, of course, saying such a night, of course. And the band kicked in, the horns kicked in. He was in his glory.
It was. I obviously one of the great misses of my life was not being there and not knowing about it. I think it was 75. 75. Yeah. It was actually even before I was still in Chicago. I had moved out here, but I mean, it's there, you know, and I probably have about 9 different formats of it and still watch it.
The only reason I was there because Robbie invited me. He said,
of course,
you got to see this. Were you surprised when Mac passed away? Was he healthy?
I was, because they had kept his illness, you know, that he was declining quiet for so long. It was one of those shocks all of a sudden, you know, on somewhere.
So Ken, does that mean that he knew that this would be his last record, do you think?
I don't know. It's that's above my pay grade. I don't know. I know that both Carla and Scarlett have told me that he was aware of his mortality, which is one way of saying I know I'm not going to be here forever. They may not know my expiration date, but I know that you know.
But do you hear that in the songs like I do?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure he. Again, I don't know. I you know, that was a very complicated brain inside that head. Yeah. So, you know, did he think that he was going to keep going? Did he think that, you know, I don't know. I don't know a lot of people that, you know, that don't think they still have more in them. So I couldn't speculate.
Well, I just one thing, just to your comments, because your ears tell you've got good ears. The Traveling Wilburys, End of the Line, which might have been a knockoff song for those 4 guys, because they were, everybody was contributing. They all had lines. They could finish a song in an afternoon if they wanted.
Yeah.
But it's a different read to it. It's quite different.
They were. I think you could say that about pretty much anything on the album. Yeah, when I remember going back to the Wilburys version, I actually, what you just said, I felt it was one of these that came together in a studio. Okay, hey, how about this? Let's try this. Let's do that. And it had a form. There was, but again, the way that it was done on this record, it was just very, I don't know. And I loved Aaron on it. It was beautiful.
Great
really
friend. They were great friends.
Yeah.
My goodness. The guest things happen that way. The actual title track, people will know the Johnny Cash version. I went back and listened to the Jack Clement's. It's a song that's been around a long time. He's probably played it just messing around. I'd never heard him do it in concert. It kind of surprised me, that one.
I had never heard that before.
Yeah.
But it was funny because again, after he passed away, and they had asked me to do this, and we were talking about country music and about the greats. What I remember is I was with him one day in New Orleans after a Jazz Fest performance, and he said, "Anything you want to hear?" Because he would do that occasionally. He was sitting at the piano. He had a gig that night, and I said, "Did you ever do 'You Win Again,' the Hank Williams song?" He said, "Yeah, I've done it live. I don't think I ever recorded it. I'm not sure." And he did. Do you know the song? It's a classic Hank Williams song, and he did "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry" on the record. But "You Win Again," and he did that song, and it was drippier than Hank's version. It was like he Macified it, which is a word he likes to use. Yeah, no, he had a knack of, again, without I think I said this to somebody the other day, without hurting it, he just made a lot of these songs. I don't want to say his own, that's kind of arrogant, but he certainly put his stamp on them and said, I'm not saying I'm going to make it any better, but I'll give it a little me. Very humble guy, as you know.
When's the last time you talked to him?
I suspect it was a Jazz Fest a few years ago.
Okay.
I go every year. Then I missed the same number of years. Jazz Fest missed the last couple. I didn't get down there this May. It was the first one I missed in many years. But I'm sure it was there. I would see him, when he was touring. It didn't come out here that often, but there were shows that I went to here. But I'm sure it was in New Orleans. And he would, there was always this kind of like you walk in and he'd be sitting there, he'd have his hand on the cane, whatever, and he'd see and squint at you and trace one eye and say, "You old asshole, what you doing here?" You were always something. You were never like just a nice guy. You had some expletive connected to your name, but God. It was and he was always gracious, and I would go to the shows at night. When he would, almost inevitably he would play tips, one night or whatever, and they were always a little different.
Are these his last tracks? He recorded a lot. He was in studio a lot. I know we're going to get live recordings and B-sides and demos and whatever. I just kind of wonder if this is the last hurrah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope not. I hope there's a lot, we keep finding things from everybody else. I hope we got them from him.
Do you know if I know that Dan Arbach is doing a documentary on Mac, and I'm wondering if they were rolling a camera in the studio for this.
That I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Be nice if somebody had. It'd be nice. And it's a great documentary. It's a great documentary. Once it gets done, put all that music together, all those years.
Yeah.
Those moments, that will be something else. I can hear. I think of when I hear Mac, I think of Memphis Minnie. I think of all of the music he must have heard in his father's shop, growing up because it was an electronics store, so you knew there was a or at least something playing music. But there would all the way back to King Oliver and Louis and stuff like that.
I think there were. I think there. I know. I know it was a music store. I mean, it was electronics and stuff like that. But I for some reason, I always thought there was a record section, and he would listen to. He would get stuff there, and that's what kind of formed him to a great extent. Were the records that were in and out of that store. But then he kind of said, "Okay, I don't need to listen to this anymore. I want to," and he went out and started looking for it elsewhere.
What's his place in New Orleans music, Ken?
That's a tricky question. I mean, there's the Louis Armstrong era. I always put him with the piano players, although he's so much more than that. And to me, it's Fess, it's Booker, it's Toussaint, it's Mac. I'm going to leave people out, and I'm going to regret it. But from that era, because they were all pretty much of the same era, and pretty much the same age. Booker may have been, Booker was around the same age. Toussaint was around that age. I mean, these guys, if you take them together, I'm sorry, Toots Washington was another one.
Yeah.
You put them all together, and you have a history because they operated on two levels. It was what they took from the generation before them, the barrel house guys, the professors, the whorehouse guys. Yeah. It was them that they were influenced by them, and then they in turn influenced John Cleary and influenced this one. They passed it on. And that was maybe the greatest thing of all that they did was they either purposefully or just by osmosis, they moved it on to the next generation. So we still have some people like that around.
Jean Baptiste,
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, Mac's in there.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. Mac, but Mac's, again, there's an offshoot there because Mac, Booker was pretty awesome as a performer, but Mac's persona, it was just so there wasn't anybody like him. Just wasn't.
Ken, you spoke at Mac's memorial, his gathering, all of his friends and family, and you were kind enough to send me the words that you wrote and spoke that day.
The writer Chris Rose described his voice as a mashup of Tom Waits, Phyllis Diller, and a bullfrog in heat. It was all that and more. It was a midnight murmur from the other side, a rogue lexicon that was neither black nor white, but somewhere in between. It was the voice of a man who could write angelic melodies with the great Doc Thomas and also enjoy squirrel brains for breakfast. Mac operated in a parallel universe of syntax and syncopation. He coaxed the words that aren't in the dictionary and found creative uses for many that are, conjugating them in previously unimagined ways. This is the part that I love doing when I did the thing, because to me, just a little aside, was I knew some of them because I had a lot of these I had heard from him, but then I called a few people because I didn't want to get them wrong and I didn't want to miss some. So I actually called Keith Spera in New Orleans, and I called I don't remember. I called a couple of other people and asked them, I called them Macisms, and I'd never heard anybody collect them. They should be a book, and hopefully they will be. But this is what he conjured words that aren't in the dictionary, and found creative uses for many that are. But you always knew what he meant. He would introduce his band as this great aggravation of musicians. When someone asked him about songwriting, he'd say, "I don't write songs, I decompose them." When someone asked him if he spoke Spanish, he'd say, "Spanish? Hell, I don't even speak English." He fathered sprouts and ran around with his podnas and assorted characters. John Lennon was to Mac John Lemon. Hurricane Katrina left him traumaticalized. He changed the name of Walk On Gilded Splinters, which was based on an old voodoo chant, because he said Splinters just sounded better than Splendor, which is what it was. And when he left a room full of people, he'd say in one of the most classic double entendres ever imagined, "This one I heard a lot. Well, I gotta go. I think it's time to ejaculate this place." So anyway, he was and you knew, I mean, you knew that a lot of this was mannered. It wasn't just spur of the moment. He made a study of Dr. John, the character, and he knew him almost as well or better than he knew Mac Rebennack. And that was the joy. I mean, you could be with either one of them and feel
Mac Rebennack would shake your hand, give you a hug, and then he'd whisper in your ear. What would he whisper?
God bless your ass. That was the traditional exit line.
This is great music we've been talking about. Invite and encourage a new generation, the last generation, to go and listen to the music that Ken Ehrlich was talking about and writing the liner notes for the album. Thank you for doing this. This is not retirement for you, is it?
No, I'm working.
Thank you very much.
Working. Thank you, Terry. It's really fun talking to you.
Thank you, buddy. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Ken Ehrlich, for almost 40 years, the producer and executive producer of the Grammys, talking about his friend Mac Rebennack, who all of us know as Dr. John. The album dropped yesterday. It's called Things Happen That Way. Actually, the record label says in their release, the last album from Dr. John. You know there will be lots of live, lots of outtakes, lots of sitting in with other people, lots of demos. There'll be a lot more Mac Rebennack music coming our way, but this is his final statement to us. I hope you enjoyed this. Go and listen to the album. Just enjoy it. Have a great time with it. Thank you for listening to the Mulligan Stew Podcast. Please subscribe to Spotify, Google Play, or Apple Podcasts. Find the details at mulliganstew.ca.